Hearty welcome to you all to the Indian Institute for Human Settlements for the 9th edition of the Urban Policy Dialogues titled Policy Cornerstones for the Next Leap.
We use this as a forum to bring together, colleagues and friends who've been working in this space and are continuing to work in this space to have a frank conversation. Irrespective of whether you're in service in government, you're running a company, you're funding a whole range of things, or you're working as a civil society organization trying to make sure that both the government and the private sector actually works quite well. The idea here is to look at core questions and try and see whether we have systemic solutions to the problems that we have. And where we do have solutions, how we can actually sort of scale them up and connect the dots. That's really the simple idea. So it's kind of a free forum. We've had some very, very interesting and difficult debates. Some of the more tricky things that have happened in the country, in the policy space, have actually been sorted out or dealt with here, either in the room or outside, over the last 10 years or so. So what I'm going to do very quickly is to give you a quick overview of what we've been doing, and for those of you who have not been here for many years, to give you a little bit of a sense of what's happening. So basically, we do this every year. There are about 50, 60 people who come into the room, and we have a deep and sharp discussion. And what we tried to do, and this is for those of us who remember 2011, when we held this thing in Vigyan Bhavan a long time ago, is we try and put together a set of documents that pull together evidence on some of the work that we're doing and other such things. So this is just a quick overview of stuff that we've done over the last 10 years or so. I'm going to focus a little bit on this. This was, about 3 years old. This is a piece of work that we did for the Finance Commission. And I thought I'd highlight it because some of the questions that I hope we're able to engage with over today and tomorrow will be tied to this issue. The core question that we were trying to deal with here was, at that point of time, basically, as the Finance Commission was literally wrapping up its own processes, was the question from the government of India is, can we do what Europe and North America were doing in terms of their massive stimulus programs to promote growth? And this is post-COVID recovery, huge programs in Europe. And in the US, of course, they've had lots of trouble trying to bring things through, but I think the Biden administration has finally managed to pull out a few, a little bit of money in spite of the complications they're having here. So the question is, could India do the same thing? And I guess one of the core questions that we tried to answer was, could we use this movement to use the process of urbanization to enable that to happen? And I would say part of this agenda has been picked up. And the reason I'm saying part is because we're fiscally strapped. So the Finance Commission itself was fiscally strapped. But the infrastructure focus that we and other people were involved in laying this out actually gives the basis for doing that. So what does the evidence look like? This is the big sweep. We've seen this before. This is all of the places in India. I mean, we do lots of big data stuff on this, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. This is every settlement. This is about 6.5 lakh places in the country, not changed very much. This is the urban-rural line, fine? So it's gone from 1951, since, post-independence census, to hopefully this census, which will happen maybe next year. Let's see how that works. There's a big data gap. These are projected numbers that are here. This is the urban-rural line. So we're about 2/3, 1/3 at the moment, urban-rural. The important thing is not that. The important thing is the size class of towns. These are the million plus cities, the 70 odd that we have at the moment. But the big opportunity actually is here. And I think many of us who are doing this work are really focused on this categories here. But the other question that we have, especially for states that are significantly urban, like Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, et cetera, or even Punjab for that matter, is in actual fact, depending on how your definitions are, the line could actually be here. So the reason I'm laying this out is we need to look at the sweep of urbanization. And the reason I'm saying that is very simple. We don't necessarily follow China very much, but this year was a very important year for them in terms of what they call the Belt and Road Initiative. Fine? So this is like, and for better or for worse, the Belt and Road Initiative is the single largest infrastructure investment program that humanity's ever seen. They put about $1 trillion of investment into that in almost 100 countries. I'm not saying that we have to copy them. I'm just saying we have to understand how that can be done. The other thing that's important to understand is between the, let's say, late 1980s to now, so about 30 odd years, maybe 35 years or so, depending on how you count it, China's gone through the largest urbanization in history. And that is what has catapulted China now, depending on whether you do PPP or otherwise, to become the second or the largest economy in the world. I'm not saying that's the way to go. I'm just saying that's the fact that exists at the current point of time. But Chinese, that big sweep of urbanization, which also gave us COVID, incidentally, right? COVID happened because of their, really effective systems of transportation, and what happened, 3 years ago with the high-speed trains, where it started in one place and then spread literally within 2 weeks across the Chinese landmass, and then of course to other parts of the world. So their process of urbanization is now tailing off, right? And it have lots of other macro implications along with the reduction in their the working force population and stuff like that. Ours has actually started. Many of us have been talking about this for a long time, but we're at the beginning of the upswing at the current point of time. So I'm saying it's important for us to look at the entire process and the entire system, because we have an opportunity that I think China has foregone. Because China has taken the route based on North American, maybe on urbanization, of hyper-urbanizing. So if you go to Beijing, Tianjin axis, you go to other places like Hangzhou, etc., you find that they're mega-urban regions of 10, 15, 100, 150, 200 million people. That's the way that they're going because they believe that's the way to go. That has created lots of interesting challenges for them because, most of their development has happened along their east coast and they have a lot of regional imbalances, etc. The question for us is, where do we want to go? And I think this is literally the time where we have to ask that question. Our politics is where it is. Our politics is still in rural India. That's the reason why, a whole range of challenges are happening even now in the urban sector, in spite of the fact that I think in between 2014 and now, we have probably invested something of the order of, 5.5 lakh crores in the urban sector, which is a huge gap. So, those of us who've seen this over 30 or 40 years, there was a big impetus on the urban question or the question of urban-rural differentials, etc., in the 1980s, with the sort of culminating in the National Commission of Urbanization, which most people don't remember as a piece of history. Then the 90s for many of us were a lost decade. Lots of work was happening in small places, but there was nothing happening at the macro scale. The 2000s saw some sort of appreciation of that question, partially because we had an economist as the Prime Minister who understood some of these questions that are there, apart from other things. So we did have some investment. And then we have a massive investment that's taken place by Indian standards, fine, over the last 10 years. And we'll see that in all the public programs. I don't want to go over them because all of you have been involved in either managing them or dealing with them or doing other things, whether it's Amrut or SPMU or whatever it is as far as that's concerned. But the point for us is, where do we see the balance between rural and urban India? And this is, of course, fundamentally a cultural question, but this is a tremendously important economic question. Because the fact is, we are now absolutely in the Anthropocene. Okay, what does it mean being in the Anthropocene? Anthropocene actually formally started in 1950, but we're absolutely in the Anthropocene, and climate change stuff is happening every day, and extremes are happening every day, and biodiversity risk is happening. What it means is that we will not be able to rely on two very critical resources, which have driven the development of many other countries, including China, and of course, all of the West and the OECD countries. One is fossil fuels, we know about that. But the other thing which I think many of us are very concerned about, and I think the primary constraint as far as India is concerned, is actually fossil water. And even though in the Indo-Gangetic Plain we think we have lots of water, actually we have a very, very serious problem with fossil water. So these two things will not be available to us. We're approaching peak oil, depending on where it is, and then maybe there will be peak coal. So the question for us is, if you are going to have serious constraints, which we know, oil externally, whatever it is, we don't have the resources, we have coal, and water, what is the pattern of development going to be? Because we're now the largest population in the world, 1.4 billion, going to 1.5, maybe 1.6, depending on how our human development works, especially in northern and eastern India. So the core question is, where's the food going to come from? Where's the water going to come from? Where the ecological services going to come from? This is a very, very critical question at this point of time. And like I said, many people in this room have been working actively on trying to address those questions, but at smaller scale. You're working in a city, you're working in a region, you're working in a district, you're working in a state. But this is now going to become an existential question as far as India is concerned. So we've had tremendous growth, and this is kind of obvious. This is the thing that we laid out very simply. All of us know about this. So basically, we've invested in the last, let's say, 30 odd years, I would say, starting with the Konkan Railway, big gap in the infrastructure thing that the British left us in some senses, massively on large-scale regional infrastructure. And that has driven, apart from other things, the growth of sort of mega-urban regions. Like I said earlier, the core question for us is not the mega-cities, not even the million cities, I would say. How are we able to handle growth and development in the smaller places? Because that's got questions for migration, that's got questions for economic development. And the big issue, of course, is not necessarily in this part of the country, where now Bangalore is bigger than Chennai. We never expected that earlier. But really what's going to be happening in these places, plus the other things that are there. So this is the thing that we laid out a long time back. Of course, lots of analytical work that we've done in the past. This is something that's, again, 6 or 7 years old, saying what are the core drivers of urbanization and what happens there. This axis is basically from the smallest village to the largest mega region, which of course is Delhi at the moment. It's a log axis. So essentially what you see here is, given our state of development, housing, water and sanitation are probably more important than roads and power in actually driving growth at the current point of time. It will change because of the nature of what's happening. Again, all this analytical work has been done. It's tied to economic models, etc. So we're saying, you know, housing, water, sanitation, roads, power, and ICT access are very critical. ICT is kind of relatively simple to do, it's cheap. The other ones are more complicated because they involve a whole range of other processes. And most critically, something that nobody talks about, and we've talked about here for years, year after year after year, is land. Okay? If we don't address land-based questions, pretty much nothing can happen. All the administrators know that, whether it's infrastructure or extending urban areas, dealing with, you know, informal settlements, dealing with affordable housing, or whatever it is, or even planning for that matter. And only some places have been able to deal with this kind of question, let's say. So what's the outcome? This is the economic landscape of India in some senses, and you can see massive sort of concentrations that are taking place. This is the sort of impact of the post-liberalization process. So 5 mega urban regions, we know all this stuff. You know, I'm not, there are gurus in the room who've done this kind of work, let's say, but also a series of economic corridors. So this one here, which is Greater Bangalore, Mysuru, which is in a sense, you know, both a gift and also a risk to Karnataka, because there's so much of concentration of both wealth and output in this region that if, you know, Bangalore catches a cold, then we have lots of problems in the rest of Karnataka in some senses. Then you have Greater Hyderabad that's going out here. You have this stuff that's building out on this side. Actually, you know, these borders are artificial if you look at economic processes, because this extends all the way up to Lahore on this side, but much more important, all the way from Kolkata to Dhaka. And you know that Bangladesh, in some senses, their numbers are a lot better than our numbers at the current point of time. So when we think about economic geographies, we have to think a little bit, you know, in a slightly wider frame as far as it's concerned. And then, of course, coastal Andhra, this is what's been building out there. And then there's a cluster that's building out here. But the real issue is not that. The real issue is what happens to the rest of the country. And I think we've forgotten this question, and this is something I think we'd like to bring back again and again here. You know, that's why I said the balance between what is so-called rural and urban is very important, because thankfully for us, we still have a culture where people can grow things. That's why on our campus, if you come there at some point in time, you'll find that we actually grow things. And this year, there are 15 different crop types that we're trying to do, not because, you know, whatever it is, we want to be able to try and see how we can integrate these landscapes in actual practice, okay? And then we laid out what needed to be done. There was a whole investment program, and there was a whatever. The upshot of the stuff is not all these fancy numbers. The upshot is, to enable the kind of things that you want, you really need only a 1% of GDP stimulus. And we're doing slightly less than that on the infrastructure sector. But the point is, it's not good enough to just do infrastructure or do large-scale regional infrastructure. You have to do stuff and fix it inside the urban areas, and especially the smaller places, because that's where the employment is going to come from. That's where the real growth, Philip, and the sustainability is going to come from. And it is, as we all know, it's much easier for us to deal with, you know, questions of solid waste, questions of water, questions of even energy supply at a much smaller scale than these huge cities, which are important, like this one, or Mumbai, or Kolkata, or Hyderabad, or whatever it is. So it doesn't require a huge amount of resources to make this happen at the national scale, but this means political prioritization, fine? Which is, I guess, one of the core questions that are there. How is it going to come? Where are the resources going to come from? Will it come as a devolution from the GST? How will the Finance Commission deal with it versus the budgetary processes? And of course, we have an interesting constraint now. 10 years ago, we had a framework to deal with this question. It was called planning. We threw it all out for maybe good reasons. But at the moment, we have almost no mechanisms to coordinate these processes in the public system. And given the fact that the public system is so important in the country, it makes it very difficult for the private sector to match up, catch up, do anything, whether it's, you know, financing or X and Y and Z, or even entrepreneurship in that kind of environment. So we have an issue here. And I think states struggle with this question, because in some states, planning is kind of alive, and others it's not, because we are quite confused in this process. But effectively, finance ministries, and I want to speak very firmly, are very important, but they are not adequate to be able to manage 10 different sectors, especially when you're trying to integrate climate change, you're trying to do equity, you're trying to do employment at the same time. So planning is very important. Thankfully, we have you know, a lot of interest in that just now. There's a high-part committee that's looking at this kind of stuff that's there. But the fact is, it's not only about what's happening in the urban areas. It is about what's happening in relationship to other areas and the connections. And we don't have a framework at the moment in many places to start thinking about this question and dealing with it, right? So I'll switch gears. I'll run through this very, very quickly. Again, this is a recap. This is what I showed you last year. This is a piece of work that we did. It took us a whole year. And the reason that I'm showing you this is, okay, I'll just show it to you for a second. So this is the work of the IPCC. There are 3 volumes here. This is 1/5 of what we did. So we took, becoming very heavy, I can't even carry this stuff. We spent 7 years writing this stuff. The chapter that I led, which is this chapter, is at the end of this. This is just one working group. There's this much of stuff. The problem that we found, and this is a very practical problem, the science is great, it's fantastic. It's the best that we can do. There were about 1,000 of us who were doing this over 7 years, including 3 years of COVID, which is horrible. But it's not useful for policymakers. It doesn't work. I mean, nobody can read the stuff. Even the scientists have trouble reading the stuff because, whatever. You can see that. So over 2022, we spent almost a whole year, a team from here, led a global processor that brought together 60 authors of the IPCC, there are about 1,000 of us, to produce something that was useful for people working in cities. It's a very simple idea. And people who work on enterprises in cities. So we brought together businesses and mayors and urban leaders and people working on climate change across the world to say, folks, what is useful for you in this? How can you build an action agenda for this? Cool? That's basically the idea. It took us a whole year. We ran meetings across the world. Thankfully, COVID had opened up, so we were able to run things in 10 different regions. The reason I'm showing it to you, again, it's the same thing that's there. Very often in this country, we don't necessarily believe, well, there are 2 issues. One is we believe that we're unique and nothing that happens anywhere in the world can work here or vice versa. So that's the Indian challenge. But the other thing that we believe in sometimes is that we are okay in our own context, but we cannot contribute to global processes. Now, unfortunately, in something like climate or in other areas, there's an interaction between what happens outside and here. If there's a conflict happening in Ukraine, it dramatically impacts us. If the European Union decides, for example, that they're going to set a carbon tax on all imports, it's going to change our trade profile. And then it will impact everybody else all the way down. So we do need to engage. But the point I'm showing this to you is, it's possible for Indian institutions, and many of us are in the room. I know in certain areas like water and sanitation and planning and stuff like that, we are very much the leading institutions in the world, to really step up and enter and start pushing these debates and helping our own people think about that. So that's what we did. This is almost a year ago. This is a presentation at COP that's there. The idea is very simple. I'll just run you through ideas here. Basically, we are now in an urban world with about 4 billion people going to 5, where everything is interconnected. When many of us started our careers a long time back, it was not so obvious. And remember, about 100 years ago, the world had 1.2 billion people. Now we have 8. So that's kind of a huge difference. We're going to go to 10. And a lot of that intermediate is going to be happening in this geography, not only India, but in the region as far as that's concerned. The challenge is now everything is interconnected. So of course, that's a huge problem for policymakers because if everything is interconnected, you don't know where to start, where to end, what to start, etc. The thing that we've learned in this process, especially on climate and biodiversity, etc., is that you cannot intervene in any process in a fragmented manner. This is how much of our policies have been. You do some really good thing. I'll give you a classic example of Delhi. Delhi did some really wonderful things because of the Supreme Court, because of colleagues in civil society organizations and the Burlal Committee, if you remember it. Basically, we did a fuel switch in Delhi. We moved from diesel to CNG. And my God, that if those of you who lived in Delhi at that point of time, for about 7 or 8 years, we thought, wow, things are good. Air quality is fine. Look at where we are just now. Why? Because most of these questions are systemic questions. What we forgot at that point of time, there was a long debate with people who were involved in that process, many of you know the folks, is that, population growth is going to happen. You're putting in a metro into the city, but the metro has no last mile connectivity. The large metropolitan area has 25 million people. Now you're going all the way up to, Meerut at one end and Aromar, etc. at the other end. So you're really building what you saw, that huge cluster that's happening there. But because there's no last mile connectivity, everybody who can afford it, who has to get to work or do something, has to buy a two-wheeler. So now we have almost as many vehicles as people in that city. So obviously the emissions are going to go up. Plus, of course, we have other complications because of land use and agriculture and dust and all the other kind of things that's there. And we know for a fact, and I just wrote about this in the Indian Express maybe a few weeks ago, that it takes a decade or 2 decades to fix an air system in a city. Because it's not only the city, you've got to do everything around it. It happened in Los Angeles, it happened in Mexico City, London did it over a much larger period. So basically, these are systemic questions. So you can't solve a systemic question by addressing one thing. You've got to address all of them. But then we're resource constrained in terms of people, institutions, and money. So you've got to start somewhere. I think that is the reason that we open up these dialogues, saying if you want to enter into this question, whether it's water or sanitation or energy or whatever, transportation or planning, where do we start with? And that question, at least in my experience, has to be answered in the context. So Kolkata's situation is going to be completely different because it's fragmented into, whatever, 17, 18 municipalities from what's going to happen in the Mumbai, Thane region. And we have people who dealt with this kind of stuff. So basically, the key thing here is that at the moment, because of the coupling of systems, a change in one affects the other. We have to be aware of that. We have to teach that for all of our students. And as we're administering it, we know that there'll be unintended consequences, like the Delhi example. Great stuff, wonderful, took a tremendous amount of effort, but it worked for a while, but eventually it became much worse than we're talking about here. So, of course, this is all the science, all the stuff that we put down here. We do have the science to figure out what works. This is at global scale. So we had said this was presented a year ago, and we were saying, look, folks, there's going to be a heat stress issue as far as this country is concerned. You saw what happened through the summer. It's going to become worse. We know it's going to become worse. We're in an El Nino. We may be, in 2 years of El Nino, and we may be having a mega drought next year. At the moment, we're not screaming drought at the moment. So we know what works. We know what the problem is. The problem sits with city geometry. There's a planning issue as far as it's concerned. There's heat for human activity, but you've got to create jobs. So you need to have industrial processes if you want to become a manufacturing hub of the world, take over from China, etc. There's implications for that. So if you look at the balance here, you can actually deal with the heat island effects by planning better and doing other stuff. But we know how difficult it is to plan. Many of us have been working for decades and not making an impact through master plans, structure plans, all the stuff that we've been doing. So the science is known, but implementing this stuff in practice is a tough job. It needs policy at the national level. It needs some stuff at the state level. It needs really good administrators at the local level. And of course, it needs everybody to work together, whether it's communities or otherwise. You can work from Mumbai, do wonderful work on producing a master plan, and then it goes into court, like we have in Bangalore at the moment. So the analytics are done. So what we did in this report was to basically say, these are all the options we have to do with mitigation. There are 25 of them. We know what works and doesn't work. These are for those of you who are not very familiar with them. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 11 is the urban one. But if you look at 3, for example, if you're a health person, and I'll show you something on health just now, you can run through this thing and see what are the things that work as far as health is concerned. Again, this is global data. This is probably underpinned by about 1,700 different articles. It took us almost a year to put this together. We are doing the same thing for India. And actually, in this country, we need to have the same evidence for every state. In fact, we're working with the government of Tamil Nadu to try and figure the kind of stuff like that. So we know what can be done. The question is how to make it happen and how to choose from this, from this menu to figure out what is possible to do in your context, what can be implemented, what capacities you have, and what can be financed. The same thing on the adaptation side, because again, I'll tell you the bad news here. I guess many of us know it. And that is we are headed, and I co-led the 1.5 report of the IPCC, like 2018. We are headed for a 1.5 degree overshoot. We are locked into that. So we're probably going to see that overshoot at the global scale within the next decade. Now, when we did the report in 2018, basically what we said is we're at 1.1 degrees over the pre-industrial average. The difference between 1.1 and 1.5 is really serious. Every 0.1 degree makes a difference, especially for India. We can see the impact. It's happening every day around, whether it's landslides or floods or X and Y, that it's going to happen. It's kind of obvious. The physics and the chemistry is locked in. You can't change that in some senses. And even if we stop emitting just now, some of those effects are going to stay for a long period of time. So we are headed for a 1.5 overshoot. What that means, of course, is we really have to stop emitting. Not only us, but across the world. That's why the negotiations are important, because we've got to convince everybody else to do the same thing as we want to do. And of course, there's a big push and pull, and we'll come to that in a second about coal. It's an important question, and I'm going to be fairly frank about that. But the fact is, we have to prepare to adapt not to 1.5. And this is the hard news that people don't necessarily know. We have to prepare to adapt to 2.7 to 3.2, which is completely unimaginable. Meaning, the Holocene, the last 10,000 years that we've seen, which has given us all of civilization, all of culture, all of religion, etc., 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 was way below 2 degrees when it started. And why am I saying 2.7 to 3.2? Because the Paris Climate Agreement, all our negotiations, which are now started in COP, like yesterday, things started off, is about getting to 2.7 and 3.2. This is what people don't tell you. The negotiations are about what we call a national determined contributions. I'll show you some evidence in a second. I'll just run through it very quickly. Is about negotiating there. So we have to start adapting to that because we know it's going to happen. Maybe not so fast, but it'll happen very quickly if you don't actually make a difference. So whether it's, I keep telling people about Mumbai, don't take a long position in Mumbai real estate unless you're somewhere near Powai. So there's a challenge there. You can't do much about it because, there are serious problems in Antarctica and Greenland that are going to lead to some challenges. And, maybe Mumbai can do what the Dutch have done. You can build big seawalls around it, fine? Or maybe New York can do it. But we can't do that for most of our cities along the coast. And we have a lot of people there. So the challenge for us is we have to try and make sure that our emissions are way below what happens to 1.5. But we'll be really stupid not to prepare for that, which means everything: agriculture, water systems, all the things that matter, and of course urban systems, which are driving the growth, driving the emissions, and creating the risk. Because the advantage of cities are you get a lot of employment, you get value added, but you're putting everybody in the same place. So then it's very easy and Kerala, remember, is a decentralized system, but look at the chaos that went on there. It was so difficult, all of us who went in and out and worked in those places. So here again, the solution that we're talking about here, this is what's being negotiated just now, is you cannot do one thing alone. Most of the time we've been focused on energy system transitions, which is great, important. We showed you what needs to get done at the micro level otherwise. But you've got to do all of these things. And we put this right on top because last year at COP, for the first time, we got 40 ministers from across the world saying, look, if you don't start fixing this stuff in urban areas, we're in toast. It doesn't work. Because the infrastructure investments are going in and you're getting locked in. When you build a metro system, you're locked in for 50 years, sometimes 100 years. Go to New York and see what's happening. I was there at the General Assembly and the city was shut down for 2 years for 2 days because of flooding. So you get locked into processes as far as that's concerned. So basically, we have to do all of these things together. 30 years ago, when negotiations were happening in Rio, we could have done energy transitions and done other stuff that's Kyoto and whatnot. Now we have no choice. India has no choice. And that's the reason why having frank conversations, irrespective of where we come from, what we're doing, are important, because these are systemic issues. And the most important thing that we've learned, both in the literature and otherwise, is that the number 5 is very important. This is the COVID learning. So the question was, how quickly can things change? And COVID taught us that if you really want to, and of course, you pay huge costs for doing shutdowns of this scale and size, things can change quite quickly. Behavior can actually change. Of course, they may not stay for very long, but it's possible to make that happen. So I think this is one thing that's very clear. I think one of the most important things that came out of this assessment, and we've reported that very clearly, is that we've been focusing a lot on energy transition, efficiency, etc. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of emissions across the world. India, it might be slightly lower because we are actually a fairly frugal culture and we have a lot of poor people who don't consume very much. But having said that, 30 to 50% of your emission reductions can happen by changes in lifestyle and behavior. But this is very hard because it means changing diets, okay? Which is a very complicated thing even in this country. If you want to start a fight in a place, you can, it's an easy one to start. It's about what food is good and better than others. And there's some implications for that which tie up with other things. So lifestyle change is very, very critical and important. We just need to figure out how to do it quickly enough and build enough consensus to make it happen, okay? So that is this piece of work that's there. This is what I was doing last year. It's here. So we took 11,000 pages and we boiled it down to 100. It's quite a job. But it hopefully makes a difference. This was the core document that was used last year in the COP deliberations. There's a new set of processes that will start in February, March next year on that. And there was a science article produced by one of our co-authors on this not a few months ago, is that for the first time in history, and this is the Holocene impact that's there, we're starting to disrupt the global water cycle. We've had local problems. We've had that forever. India's historically, ever since, if you go to any of the sites in Gujarat, Mohenjo-daro sites, you can see the impact of drought 3,500 years ago, whatever. You go to many sites, you can see the impact there and see the response. But we've never had a situation in all of history where the global hydrological cycle is at risk. And that is starting to happen. Again, very simply, temperatures rise, the relationship in the oceans and the land changes, and you can see what's happening. And like I said, the drought that we're having this year, next year may be much worse. Let's see how that's going to play itself out. So this is a piece of work that we did. We anchor the Global Commission on the Economics of Water here. And I guess the simple question is, this is the SDGs for those of you fancy way of looking at it just now, is if you look at all of these processes, especially the dark ones that are there, essentially water is a common thread that connects pretty much across all the SDGs. I mean, these slides will be available to you folks. So, I mean, you're welcome to take shots of it. But yeah, I would say get the narrative and then we can open up the discussion more than anything. And so these are available. So water connects pretty much, we know that. Now water is connected to everything. We can't survive without it. And in some senses, this is where the evidence starts making a difference. So this is a projected risk as far as floods are concerned, fine? And this is not coastal, this is partially coastal flooding, but this is inland flooding that's there. The point is all of our cities and our systems are designed for a particular kind of rainfall. We've evolved like that, no? All our agricultural systems. But as you can see here, you can see what the flood depth incidences are like, especially in this part of the country, also along the coast. The models are pretty clear about this kind of stuff. The other thing that's also very critical is the loss of terrestrial and freshwater, terrestrial and another form of fresh water is going to have a tremendous impact on biodiversity. So if we think the climate crisis is a serious crisis, I think we need to reconsider stuff. Maybe some of us will not be around when this hits us, but once it hits us, this is the thing that's going to hit us really badly. So you can see here, this is the percentage of biodiversity loss, starting at 1.5, fine? This is a place where we're almost certain not to get. This is where we're probably going to happen very much in our lifetimes here. Again, not huge significant impacts of this scale inside the subcontinent here, but you can see huge impacts there. But look at this. This is what we're negotiating, fine? This is what's being negotiated just now. The impacts are going to be huge. And we know, agriculture, even if you take an absolutely anthropocentric view of this thing, all these systems are basically dependent on life. If you don't have life, you can maybe produce food for rich people in vats and some bioreactors, etc., but you can't produce it for 1.5 billion people, not possible, fine? So this is the deepest underlying crisis we have, and it's tied to all of these things, changing temperatures, CO2 levels, and of course, most centrally water. So basically, there is a huge opportunity here to tie together the three agendas. This is a presentation that I made. There was a special session of General Assembly of the UN in February, trying to open up the discussion for the 2023 water conference. And I think what we did make a big sense, because for the first time, many countries, some of them in fact, are in deep conflict with each other, upstream and downstream of the Nile, other areas, even the US up and downstream, apart from our own issues that are here. Basically, if we do not address the water crisis, we're all very focused on carbon. It's very important. But for us in India, if Indian scientists had discovered climate change, I think we would have used not temperature, but we would have used rainfall as the core driver. Because the monsoon is the most important thing for us, our entire culture, our entire economy, and even our cities, which think they're sort of bereft of the monsoon, depend on that. So basically, this balance is out of kilter. And once it shifts, we're in deep trouble. So what is the challenge? Too little water. Very simple thing. And the funny thing, of course, is we're not used to the idea that a place that has too little water will 6 months later have flooding. Okay, but that's, if you know a little bit about meteorology, etc., that's the kind of thing that happens, no? It's about extremes in some senses. So this is the risk index as far as too little water, as far as drought is concerned, and we have a big problem here. This, as I've been saying for more than 15 years, or maybe longer than that, is the proximate risk to our cities. It isn't flooding. We are very worried about flooding, especially when lots of rich people's cars go underwater. But the real issue here is drought. And you can see why the issues are like. This is the implications as far as that's concerned. In fact, the IPCC projections, if we continue with them, by the 2050s, there will be 500 million people who are at risk to food stress, I would say famine, across the world. And that's why we're saying continuously, and one of my co-chairs is the DG of the WTO, we have to have a robust trade system, because we will not be able to produce enough, we'll be able to produce enough food, but it'll be in the wrong places. And if there's no food in the wrong places, you know what happened? People will move, no? This is the history of what happened in India in the 18th and the 19th century. This is going to happen again, right? So that's lots of other stuff. These are the yield gaps. Again, farmers in Punjab, Haryana, northwestern India, they are doing lots of interesting things. They produce food security for this country, but we're going to be in deep trouble. The PDS system is going to collapse because of the challenge not only of deep groundwater, but there's going to be serious issues as far as that's concerned. But simultaneously, we're also one of the world's capitals of flooding. So these are the historical flood events that are there, and these, of course, are the big cities that are exposed to it. Many of us come from these places as far as that's concerned. Another complication, when you have too little water and you have lots of interesting things happening, you have a lot of pollution that's there. This is a big issue. So it's simple. Too little water, too much water, too polluted water. You've got to fix that. And it's a systems question, fine. You've got to do it downstream, upstream, etc., like we did with watershed development many, many years ago. And of course, there are serious trade-offs between food, water, energy, like I said here, including now because of climate, between biofuel and food production. Because one of the core things that we're trying to do on the climate side just now is to capture carbon. Okay, what's the best way to capture carbon? You say, okay, today I want to plant, 5 billion trees, 1 trillion trees, etc., etc. Where is that going to come from? It needs land, it needs water, and where they're going to come from places where you can grow the trees, and that's the place where you have a conflict on water, land, and food production. So basically, same story. This is a systemic view of what's happening, what are the options, what are effective as far as that's concerned. We have the options as far as that's concerned. So in a sense, the thing that we tried to open up, and I think we did make a big difference in this, in the intergovernmental system, was all countries, in fact, all cities, and everybody who's been a collector knows that there are a lot of operating conflicts at the local level. We've been dealing with this for decades. Then there are things that happen at transboundary level, and we have that. I mean, the classic story here is the ongoing tussle where Supreme Court has to come in every few months and say, Karnataka, please give water to Tamil Nadu. And this is just one basin, etc. And then we have the other story, which is one of the most interesting stories of sort of intergovernmental relations, the 1950 Indus Water Treaty, which in spite of the conflicts that we had in Pakistan is still held. There's 600 conflicts across the world in this space. Okay? And the reason I'm saying this to an urban audience is that the biggest constraint that we have, in some senses, is that cities need water. Cities don't produce water. Cities don't produce food. So we need to have food and water security to make that happen. And when you have a mega region of 10 million people, 100 million people, or even 25 million people as an administrator of a large city, it's a nightmare during the difficult months that you have at the moment. So the story that we're able to sell is, look, forget the conflict that you're going to have between your countries. This is a global crisis. Let's try and see whether we can work in the next 10, 15 years or so, just like we did in climate, to try and build up some kind of a negotiation, potentially a treaty, to be able to deal with water as a common. And what do you mean by water as a common? It means the monsoon, which affects everything from East Africa, all of South Asia, all the way to China. These things are actually going to shift. It's not a joke. It's happening at the moment, at the point of time. So you have to deal with these questions in their context and come to sharing agreements to make this thing happen. So, I mean, you can see what we're talking about. Basically, as we call it, the blue and green water limit has been exceeded. Jagdish has done this work. He's standing in the back on what's actually happening. We're over at the global scale, we're over that balance, okay? We know since the 1990s that in terms of ecological flows, we're at about 100% deficit at the moment, which basically means we're taking down nature as we go. So the core challenge for us globally was to bring together these sustainable development things, which are important for human well-being, etc., economic development, with climate, with biodiversity conservation. Now, this is a very tricky problem because we're not used to doing this. We've been trained with a form of economics which says, what are the trade-offs, what are the cost benefits, take the most optimal solution. There are no optimal solutions anymore. That's the challenge. So we have to think differently. We need people and institutions who are able to be heterodox, who can work through these systemic things that are there and say, look, looking at one particular optima, one particular part of the problem is not going to help us solve it. We have to look at the systemic elements of it. It's hard. It takes sometimes decades to make these changes, right? And, I give you air quality as a small challenge. Water is a much bigger challenge when you're talking about transboundary stuff. Because immediately this becomes a question of conflict, saying, okay, we'll use geoengineering, we'll start seeding clouds here because we don't want our water to go somewhere else. Because actually, if you look at the way the global water flows go, a lot of the water that is transpired from India, where does it go? It goes to Southeast Asia and also to China. So you say, okay, I don't want to give China water, I'm going to do something here. You burn your nose to spite your face or whatever it is. And same thing for other places. Ukraine is a central location, let's say, which is giving water to Europe and to Russia. So these are larger things that till we started looking at the earth in a more concrete way, it couldn't actually play itself out. So we basically lay out a framework just now, which is now the UN is considering, where we start bringing together all these things together. This is a different way of thinking. We do not have good examples of how this can be done to scale. We know how it can be done locally, in this building, maybe in the city, maybe in a region. We don't know how to do this at the scale of, forget about 1 billion people, even at 100 million people. To do this thing for Uttar Pradesh would be like something else. Uttar Pradesh would become like Europe. And we need all of these other processes to line up before that happens. If you don't have the governance, biggest issue here, and the finance and the institutional capacity, plus of course the tech, it doesn't work as far as that's concerned. So anyway, I'm just showing this to you because part of the dialogue sitting behind what we're doing here is a set of these conversations. Of course, we're working on water at the ground level, we're working at the regional level, etc. But we have to look at the back and forth between that. And then I'll just quickly lay out 2 more things before I close here. This is a report that we just released last week in London. This is called the Lancet Commission. The question that we're trying to ask here, is there a connection between health and climate change? Fine? We all know that there's a connection. The question is, what are the ways that we can intervene in it, and what's the evidence to make it happen? Because, it's good to say it's connected. Obviously, we know it's connected. The question is, what can we do in that? And I'll show you basically how it works, what are the key pathways. So we spent a whole year doing this kind of work. Some of the best people from across the world doing this kind of thing that's there. We had Helen Clark, who is the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and then the head of UNDP, etc. So basically, if you're looking at what happens on the health side, how many people die, how much years of lives are lost, etc. What are the key things that drive it according to our current understanding? The most important thing at the moment, at the current point of time, is transportation systems. Right? I mean, again, I'm just giving you, it's intuitive in some senses, but till you look at the evidence, you can't see what the connections are. So you can look at that. What does it impact? It impacts respiratory disease, we know that. It also impacts cardiovascular disease, because having bad transportation systems also means that a whole range of people, especially younger and older people, are not walking around very much, they're not very active, and there are impacts on that. And then typically there are correlations between type 2 diabetes and physical activity and stuff like that, okay? So that's the most important. The second one, of course, is diet. Again, pretty obvious. If you're a physician, and we have people who work on health at the moment, this is kind of obvious, right? But now we know, or at least we have some sense of what the pathways are like. This is a global study. And the reason we did this is because on Monday, the COP Ministerial on Health, first time, and climate change is happening. And we know, of course, there's a relationship between the two. And most of us know that most of the interventions on environmental health or even air pollution, when you do the cost-benefit analysis, the thing that makes a difference is really the valuation of what health is like. That's what tilts it from going from a CBR of less than 1 to 2 or 3. Most of us know how that's done. But we need to see how these pathways work, because as you can see, it's a spaghetti there. No? So even in the health sector, if you want to address this, there's a whole range of other cross connections that need to be dealt with as far as that's concerned. So basically, this is the mitigation side that's there. And then we said, okay, this is what the evidence is like. How do you fix it? You phase out fossil fuels. That's kind of obvious in some senses, because you saw the PM 2.5, other things that are there. Okay, you improve insulation, that's for the West, and ventilation in your homes. Again, quite obvious. And you can see the difference between inside and outside. In this place, if you want to have fresh air, and Bangalore is very good for that, you're also going to bring in the PM 2.5 at the same time. So there's a trade-off as far as that's concerned. Then, of course, low-emission electric vehicles. This is a big shift that's there. You can see how the connection is. Most critical question, active transport and public transport. This is a core planning question. This is about the structure of your city. Can you have walkable areas? Bangalore is wonderful, but the footpaths don't work. Right? So, you have to literally sit in a wheelchair, and nobody's made a film about that, or get from one place to the other wheelchair, and you'll realize what the real challenge is. Not a big deal to fix the footpaths, but we don't put our energy into making that happen. Solid fuels is very important for cooking. This is the fuel switch that's there. This is the wood, and in northern India, the cow dung that's used. This, of course, is a Western thing in some senses, but it's becoming very important for us also. As we become richer, like everybody else, we are using more meat. Red, of course, is not so good at all. We have some issues there, but basically moving to a different diet. And then, of course, green areas. So, but again, you can see their causal linkages are quite complex and interconnected, and this is a global thing. This is like theory. We have to be able to figure this out for our own location, and the health folks in the municipality or whatever it is that's working there have to talk to the planning folks, have to talk to the other people who are dealing with a whole range of other things, because even in health you have the tuberculosis people not talking to nutrition people, talking to other people that's there. But if you're doing it, once you do that, there are 5 or 6 things that need to get done, and it'll make a difference. No, you can start with thermal comfort, because that's the core issue. People are facing that. But you have to deal with other stuff, because it's going to come back and bite you somewhere else. So basically, we have to, this is the agenda for next week in the COP. So how do you integrate this thing into the Paris Climate Agreement? And I'll close with this very quickly, because this is the last piece of work that we've done, and I think we're going to share this report with you. The core thing in this question here, is where you get the money from. It's not a very nice thing to say, but basically when the money flows, things tend to happen. And we just picked up this piece of work because this is one of the biggest issues that we have in the country at the moment, and even otherwise. There's this big thing that keeps on going on. No? The West agreed to give $100 billion every year to lots of other people. That never happened. And because of that, we're not doing very much. At least that's what the narrative says. In actual fact, that's not completely true. So this is the the hard-nosed stuff that comes from this. Basically, if you're looking over the next 8 years or so, if we continue the way that we are just now, and there's a book that just come out just now which says 8% growth, fine. The magic for India is to be able to keep at least 8% growth, let's say, because then you can deal with poverty, you can deal with inequality, you can deal with basic services, and then you can become whatever you want to become, 4 trillion, say 5 trillion, etc. That's a different story, let's say. But the challenge is, if we continue in the current frame of development, especially urban development, let's say, and regional development, the projected losses are at about 3 to 10%. Forget about 10%, even 3. And I can tell you this because we did this estimate almost 20 years ago for Gujarat, where we were showing year on year, the actual GSDP compression for Gujarat, largely because of drought, was about 2%. So Gujarat's been going dramatically well for the last 30 years, but that was a regular compression, and you can see that going up and down in drought years and various things as far as that's concerned. So imagine, of course, end of the century, forget about it. In 2050 or so, you're still managing to do what the Chinese did between 1980 and now, just managing to do something between 8 and 11% growth. That's what drove their process, let's say. You net out 3% from that. Okay, we will probably never get to 8 to 10%. We went that for 1 year. So if you're at 8%, you net out 3%, let's say. Look at where inflation is. You know what the answer to that question is. So we need to act now because it's going to hurt us. Our economic development is not going to work without that. Now, our commitment, right, this is on the GDP side. Our commitment for the NDCs, the 2.7 commitment that we have, all the projections speak to about somewhere between 7 to 8% investment. So again, just to give you the numbers, our savings rates are now slightly lower than 30%. They were about 30%, now they're slightly lower. We've had not very good years. Our investment rates are slightly lower than that. So let's say 27, 28%. Okay, if you're going to take, of the 27, 28%, if you're going to take 8% and put it into the energy sector, the question is that a good idea or not? But if you don't do that, there's going to be huge implications later. So that's the investment question. Now, the horrible story is not that. The horrible story is if you want to get to 1.5, all the silly things that I've been saying, stable of 1.5, adapt to 2.7, you need a lot more resources. You're going to use, a third, maybe, of your total savings rates. And our savings rates are still very high. As we become richer, like in China, savings rates will start dropping. We know how that works, into dealing with this question. It's a serious issue. It's not a joke from the finance side. It's not a simple thing that's there. And because this is going to compound over time, it's a very critical question. That's a big thing. So this is a big number. It's a large share of what we're doing. We'll have to prioritize it. The question is, what are you going to trade it off with? Health, education, how will you sequence it? Is it going to be water you're going to give up with, or it's going to be dealing with, whatever, conspicuous consumption is something else? It's a social choice, and of course, it's a policymaker's choice, whether it's you're sitting in the Ministry of Finance or the other things. So this is the headline statement there as far as that's concerned. The challenge for us is not only a question of investing. We have to shift our investments away from what we're doing to something else. India also provides massive, like many other parts of the world. Actually, the investment in renewables at the current point of time is just starting to cross the amount of fuel subsidies across the world. So our investment in making the transition is less than what, especially now after Ukraine. There's been a massive resurgence, if you look at, people follow the stock prices of the energy companies across the world, in exploration of oil and gas. Because, the classic example is Australia. Australia is doing tremendously well on the transition to renewables. They're actually going to get to 50% or plus more in terms of solar PV. But they are mining coal like they've never mined coal in their entire history of that country. Why? Because the coal prices are what they are. So the thing is, we're going to have a cap on coal, let's use the stuff, let's send it out. So there's going to be emitted somewhere or the other, right? So we have to, of course, invest in renewables. That's doing pretty well. But you've got to move stuff away from other things that are highly carbon dependent. And even the European Union's investment plan, the green stimulus plan, that's there, less than 20% of that investment is currently going into green investment. So you're building structures, processes, etc., that are locked in, right? So very quickly, the big news, of course, is there's a lot of money in climate finance. So those of us who are saying, okay, I was doing work on social development, X and Y and Z, maybe I should be doing some stuff in climate. I think we've got good Indian trader brains who say, this is good, it's happening. Mitigation finance now is running at about 3 lakh crores. It's a lot of money as far as that's concerned. Now, the interesting thing is the money is not coming from the outside. Most of the money is coming from the inside. We don't necessarily recognize this. It's in all kinds of forms. You can see all this stuff that's there. Clean energy, clean transport, and of course, energy efficiency, which is big. That's what Prasad was showing at the current point in time. It's not necessarily showing because of all these systemic issues that's there. The other thing that's there, which is very problematic, is, if you saw the earlier thing, it was 3 lakh crores. Less than 10% of that is going into adaptation. Big problem. We better start doing this very seriously. Of course, we are now, as good accountants, we're doing, we're counting everything as adaptation, because it's nice and it makes sense. But in that, you can see this is responsive stuff. Some of the people who work on this are not in the room, they'll probably come in tomorrow. So this is the obvious thing. This is Kerala, this is Amphan, it's everything that's happening in other places, and drought management, which should be a lot more, which I just showed. And of course, this kind of stuff that's there. So the headline statement here, this is about 10% of the investment. Very bad for India. We have to act more. So if you do the things right in the first place, build capacities, reduce vulnerabilities, increase employment, it actually makes sense. And the multilateral stuff is less than 5%. So if you're following the money trail, this is great, lots of hype, various things as far as that's concerned. It's been going up and down over time, but this is not the big story at the moment. We're doing our stuff ourselves. So the question then is our position that we're taking just now really useful for us? I guess internally what we're saying in the country and what we negotiate may have different views because of national interest and stuff like that, but this is the objective fact as far as it's concerned. We have a fairly sophisticated architecture, and again, the report is available, you can see this, how it, what comes in, etc., etc. So even though in this particular thing, the multilateral institutions, bilateral institutions are big and they like to do big things, the real money is here, in the government. So what's the big story here? We are in coal, and we're going to be locked into coal for a long period of time. We can have a debate about where and how and what, but that's both our negotiating position. From Glasgow, if some of us know a little about climate, we said no phase out, but phase down. And there's a reason for that, because that's the only security that we have. But it has significant implications. And our transitions, if they happen, will happen through gas. And we don't have much gas. And even if we did have the gas, we probably want to use it as a, for fertilizer. So there's a really tricky situation, similar to what we had in the 80s and the 90s when we were dealing with this same kind of question, but at a much smaller scale, at an economy that was maybe 1/10 as far as that's concerned. So the energy transition is happening, fine? And it's happening primarily because of the reduction on the cost of renewables. It's currently stupid to use coal from a financial point of view. And that factor is going to increase to almost 3 to 5 times in the next 15 or 20 years as it becomes more and more expensive as the external costs come in. But we are still locked into coal for various reasons. So that's an interesting conundrum that we have to deal with, because our base load is based on that, our employment is tied to that, and most important, the political economy is tied to that. Fine? Okay? But in spite of that, these are 3 different scenarios. This is the baseline scenario. That's what, that's business as usual. This is what we're committed to. This is 2C, where we'll probably get to, and this is 1.5C. The thing to see here, of course, is where the emissions coming from outside the power generation sector are coming from. This is transportation, this is industry, and this is building. And where's transportation? It's coming from our freight systems that are there, which are using increasingly not rail, but other things that are there. This is coming, of course, from our industry that's very hard to abate. So steel, cement, glass, these are things, when we make the choices to build with them, we're locking ourselves into certain sets of things. And that's why what Prasad is trying to do is really important. And buildings, of course, are somewhat less, even though we're going to be building a lot of buildings. So we pretty much know what's happening. Fine. So emission reduction is very important in these sectors. But the thing is, it has to be done right across the supply chain. India's finally, on the chip and the IT sector, taken some very bold decisions in the last couple of years. Fine. We started doing work on all kinds of stuff in the 70s in the country, but there's not a single fab in this country because of policy in a whole range of regions. This industry is the reason why China has very quietly, over the last 20 years, taken over, because they understood the geopolitics of the process, taken over the global energy system. They knew if China had to become the single largest economy of the world without serious conflict, the only way to do that is to pick up certain critical industries, and they've, from end to end just now, and we know this, from lithium all the way to the largest markets in the world, are in control of these industries. Because eventually, whether you like it or not, energy and water, they don't control water as yet, are critical to what's happening here. So we need an awful lot of money to make this happen, right? And you can see the numbers are very large just now. These are, very large shares of that 100 billion that's there. This is just to meet the NDC target. This is our India's projections that are there. So basically, it's a good thing for us to go low carbon. And in the long run, all the modeling work that we've done, my colleagues are here who've done this kind of stuff, in the long run, it actually makes sense to do it now. Because there's not much difference in the long run between low energy otherwise. But we have taken the decision to be able to stick with coal. Okay? There's one more thing that's important, and that is, and I'll just show it to you, it's what we call, it's a technical term, it's a transition risk, which basically means we have, since the 10th plan onwards just now, we made this big investment in supercritical coal. So you clean up the coal, you wash it, so you don't put a lot of ash in the thing, in the atmosphere, et cetera, and then you have high efficiency production systems that are there. And we've invested massively in this process. Of course, now we're importing 1/4 of our coal. That's another story, another political economy. India has the largest position on South African, Indonesian, and Australian coal in the world. But the core question that I'm going to try and make here is that there's physical risk. That is, when you have climate change, it impacts cyclones and flooding and stuff like that, and we can maybe address that. But there's also the transition risk of being locked into infrastructures that are going to be there for not 10 years or 20 years, like solar PV, but 30, 40, 50 years. And we put lots of money into that kind of stuff that's there. So these are the kind of things that are involved. So most of the discussion has been on stranded assets. I'll also show you just now very quickly, and I'll close with that, that there's a lot of issues about stranded jobs here. So we talk about a just transition between us and other parts of the world. We should get resources and paid off, and there should be loss and damage, reparations, et cetera, et cetera. There are also issues inside the country. And the reason I'm saying that is, if you go back to the first slide that I said to you, some of the most underdeveloped parts of the country, within quotes, are the ones where we should face the most serious impact. Right? Because we know that our coal resources, for example, and our pithead mines and our pithead production units are in those locations that are there. So the people who have not contributed to, have not gained in some senses, for all the good things that have happened since liberalization, within quotes again, are going to suffer the most significant losses at the current point of time. So stranded assets is a big issue. I'll show you what that means. But the real and interesting story here is in the coal sector. Right? So we've invested almost, this is again, like I said, 11-12 plan, et cetera, et cetera. We invested about 90 billion, the numbers are not clear at the moment, in coal-based power plants over that period of time. Right? And half of that investment is public investments, going from the fisc. Okay? But of that share that's there, about 40 gigawatts, we've added, almost a similar amount on the renewable side. These are stressed assets just now. So, the energy sector is a very important sector in the country. We've historically had a lot of problem in trying to fix the energy sector and deal with all the losses that are happening there. But this is on the production side. So if you have a very large amount of investment, largely public, that's sitting in stranded assets, you have a huge problem. We've done Uday and a whole range of other things that are there. But there's a big issue that's happening here. And because of our treaty commitments and otherwise, we have, even though we don't think about it, we have a lot of exposure as far as that's concerned. This is the amount of exposure that my colleagues have estimated of borrowing from the financial institutions, and it's big. That's in lakh crores. So, yeah. So it's very big, and the bulk of it is in transpiration. So how do you enable this to happen? You have to do many things at the same time. And I just focused, as I closed just now, on dealing with coal. You have to do, obviously, providing compensation to investors. That's a big issue that's there. But the most critical thing is to deal with people who are currently available. We have 7 million people employed in the coal sector, both directly and indirectly. Okay, and we know where they are, by and large. Now, the complicated issue that happened after the second round of coal block auctions that the Supreme Court had initiated is that we've changed our policy to do a very interesting thing. Before that, all the royalties that went from anything under the ground, oil, gas, etc., went to the government of India. So for the first time, and it seems like a good idea, the government of India and the state government start sharing the royalties. So if you look at the people who do public finance here, look at the thing there, you see a big bump up in royalties in certain states. Maharashtra, not very much because it's not much of coal. Neyveli, not very much in Tamil Nadu because Neyveli is very old. But you see that happening in Jharkhand, in Odisha, etc., etc., etc. Right? So we are locked in fiscally. Right? We've also got a huge issue here in terms of people. And of course, there's wonderful ideas conceptually that in areas which have a lot of coal, you also have a lot of sunshine, so you can shift from coal to renewables, lots of solar stuff that's there. But it's not so simple. Those of us who've done this kind of work in the past, it means completely rejigging entire processes. It's very easy to say, we will train people, we will do all this other kind of stuff that's there, but we have a big, big issue as far as that's concerned. So this is a big question, and the reason I'm saying this is, if we have to solve, and I've just taken this as one example, we have to solve some of the really difficult problems of neither the 5 mega urban regions nor the urban clusters, etc. And that's why the rural-urban connection is very important. We have to do all of this. This is an impact of our industrial development model, which has given us a growth, which has allowed us to do all the stuff that's happening. But the fact is that there are deep issues here that are not so simple. So they're interesting and difficult trade-offs. So I thought I'd lay this out for you because the spirit of this conversation over the next 2 days or so is to go and say, look, if this is the reality, I've just given you one view of it, you may have many others. How do we get into these questions and deal with them? There are no easy solutions. We've all done little things here and there. All of us have been part of those processes. Some of them have good things happening, some of them bad things happening. But we're at a very difficult juncture in time, but also with tremendous opportunity, fine? So I'm saying what started in China 40 years ago is in motion here. If we can redirect that and manage to deal with equity, justice, productivity, etc., 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 we can do remarkable things because the people of this country are tremendous. And our institutions are also pretty good, even though we keep cursing them and doing all kinds of stuff about they're not working, whether they're public or private or civil society, etc. The question is, how do we bring them together to be able to achieve these kind of outcomes? And that requires, I think, a change of mindset in a whole range of sectors and the idea of building partnerships. And in some senses, and that's what we try and do here, of speaking truth to ourselves and to power in some ways. Okay, we do great stuff and it's wonderful, but actually it's only dealing with part of the problem. It's going to come back, no? It's a Delhi air story again. And you can see it. We know that. But because of our own circumstances and constraints, we don't necessarily have the opportunity or the space to stand up and say, guys, it doesn't work like this, let's try and fix it. And we can't do it alone. It cannot be done by any particular sector, individual, people alone. It has to be done collectively, whether it's civil society or universities and knowledge institutions like ourselves, or the private sector, which is very, very important. All this infrastructure stuff is happening through the private sector. So the stranded assets are sitting in the private sector. They're sitting on the balance sheets or whatever it is. In fact, I didn't show you this horrible slide. I didn't want to depress you. But the NBFCs are a monster story. You hear the RBI governor talking about this all the time. The NBFCs have really bad exposure to stranded assets in the energy sector. Why? Because they lend to people who the banks don't necessarily lend to, especially scheduled banks. Fine? And they sometimes get quick return. But if you have a state government deciding to change its policy and there's a lot of assets that are in place, you're in deep trouble. So their balance sheets are looking bad, and if that looks bad, then it affects the whole financial system, etc., etc., etc. We kind of know that, but we'll pick that up in the discussion. But I thought the reason I led you through this arc is these things are unfortunately connected to each other. So we have to act on something concrete in each sector and stuff, but there are externalities and other processes that are there. So while there are trade-offs, there are also synergies between these things that can strengthen each other. You deal with something on the water sector, it has an implication for food. If you do that, it has an implication for the amount of energy you're using to pump the groundwater or other stuff like that. So we have to think and act on those kind of processes. And the critical thing that, at least in my experience, is you need to have institutions that have the ability to stay and work, and it takes decades to make these changes. And for that, you need people like all of us in the room here who can lead those processes through thick and thin, all the ups and downs of government or the private sector or stock markets, etc., who can stay the course to make it happen. And it's really, I think, it's an honor to have people who've actually done this thing or these things in their own places. The question is, how can we expand this room to have 10, 20, 100 times the number? That's why the educators are in the room, no? That's been our hope for all these while. Our students and people we're working with will take on and build out these kind of processes. So I'll stop there and, yeah.